Florida State and Clemson just got the okay to leave the ACC. That's huge for the Big 12. This is a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars crossover.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars crossover. I'm Drake Toll from America's #1 Big 12 podcast, Locked On Big 12. That is Jake Hatch talking all things BYU over at Locked On Cougars. Thank you for making our shows your first listen every single day. We will start with a settlement on the way per ESPN between the ACC and Florida State and Clemson. And this is going to limit the number, that price it would cost for those two to exit the league. They can leave much earlier. By 2030, they'll likely be gone. We'll go there. Then, are we ultimately just going to be in a super league? It was reported last week on another program. That is exactly where we're heading, and it's happening right now. I don't think that's the case. We'll see if Jake agrees with me. And then BYU got Utah's basketball coach fired. How? Stick around. Jake, ESPN drops the bombshell that Florida State, Clemson, the ACC are meeting this week and talking about a settlement when these two schools a year and a half ago decided to sue. It seemed like complete chaos that those two would leave. And they're still here. But Andy Staples says when the lawsuit started, the ACC argued there was no number a school could pay to get out of the league with its TV rights. As of tomorrow, there is a number, and it goes down every year. The number was the goal. Clemson and Florida State got it. Now, instead of $700 million, they can pay $200 million to leave the ACC, and that price tag will ultimately be the downfall of that conference.
Oh, absolutely. Here's the thing, Drake. These two schools, speaking of Clemson and Florida State, got exactly what they wanted. They can call this a settlement all they want. It's a victory for those two schools because now, as you mentioned, at some point, whether it's this year, next year, 3 years down the line, there's going to come a day when that number is right at the sweet spot and they'll buy themselves out and they'll jailbreak themselves out of that league. And yeah, the ACC is going to go the way of the earth.
It is a power move for not just Florida State and Clemson, but also UNC and Miami and the schools that feel as though their value is not good enough. With this settlement, too, and I think it should be known off the top, if there's something you should take away with it, the conference has decided it will rework how it pays schools based on your last 5 years of TV viewership, how prominent of a brand you were. They've got a formula to build it up. They're going to give you more money. So Clemson and Florida State could make $15-20 million more a year from the conference and get closer to where the SEC and the Big Ten, to where those conferences are, what they're paying their schools. That won't appease them forever. That won't be a number that's going to keep them around forever. And moreover, if you're Virginia Tech, if you're Louisville, if you're SMU, you are hurt by that. You're going to lose $8 to $10 million a year in revenue if you have a down year in football now and go from being on par with the Big 12 to $10 million behind a Big 12 school. From here, Jake, it's not just those teams at the top that don't want to be in the ACC and could pay their way out. It's the teams at the bottom who've been kicked in the face and could now seek out a conference like the Big 12.
Well, here's the thing. If you're a Wake Forest, I know that Wake Forest doesn't generate a lot of news, but if you're a Wake Forest out there, there's discontent all of a sudden because you're like, oh, gee, so now we're going to be behind the 8 ball even more than we already were. Gee, thanks, ACC. Yeah, Drake, the way that this has all been structured, this settlement, I call it a settlement in quotations because they can call it, like I said, a settlement if they want to. This is going to cause discontent all across that league, and it will ultimately lead to the demise of the ACC, which should help the Big 12.
This is pretty stark stuff from Big 12 Mafia. I hate to say it, but this ACC settlement is not good news for the Pac-12 or the American. On its face, it tries to sell continuity, but in fact bleeds indecisiveness. The ACC might have openings soon. This is going to boil over into, because we know that Jim Phillips, the conference commissioner, wants to keep itself alive. This is going to boil over into the AAC, into the Mountain West, into the Pac-12, because from here, now Memphis or USF becomes much more viable because there must be a contingency plan for the conference, for the Atlantic Coast Conference to stay alive, because they know now by 2030, when the $100 million exit fee is very attainable, those major schools are going to leave. And once again, Louisville's not happy with you.
And that's the issue about this is, yeah, there are going to be contingency plans being put in place and will be in place by that point. The bigger issue here is who can they scoop up in theory that is going to keep that conference afloat. But as we've seen with the Pac-12, Drake, they're still seeking out finding what exactly their membership is going to be and ultimately what their dollar figure is going to be in the new media rights deal they're going to get. The ACC's got to be looking at the Pac-12 saying, hey, that's our future 3, 4, 5 years down the line here. We better get ready for it and realize that reality is going to hit quick, and you better be ready to absorb the hit because it could be an absolutely catastrophic hit for some of these schools that are leveraged to the hilt with debt.
This, to me, is a Band-Aid on a bullet hole, understanding that in 5 years' time, not even, that we talked earlier on the Big 12 squad that releases on Thursday about 15 years down the road. We shouldn't worry about that as the Big 12 because so much can change between now and then. This is a 5-year, the time that it takes to go to college for most people, a 5-year window, and the ACC is going to look completely different in 2030, 2029, and 2030. This settlement opens the door for Clemson and Florida State to leave, and it spits in the face of everybody else in the conference. I do think from the Big 12 perspective now that Brett Yormark must be licking his chops because really when that $100 million price tag hits in 2030, you call Louisville, you call Virginia Tech, you call Georgia Tech, Pitt if you want, and create a Big 12 that's much, much deeper.
Well, and that's the thing about this, Drake, is you all of a sudden, your media rights for the Big 12 go back to market in 2030, obviously ahead of that 2031 expiration. Well, guess what? As that ACC date gets closer and closer, all of a sudden, Brett Yormark starts making those overtures, as you mentioned, to these schools. You obviously call the Miamis, the North Carolinas, the big dogs of the conference and say, hey, what's your interest level? But you call those schools you think have a strategic interest for you as a Big 12, and you make those overtures. And then as soon as the Clemson and the Florida States decide to jailbreak themselves, you swoop in, you scoop up who you want, and you leave the rest to fend for themselves.
The best part of this is when Cincinnati has a down year in football, they get the same amount of dollars from the Big 12. Mm-hmm. When Houston is down, when BYU is up, those schools are getting the same amount from their TV revenue share. That is, now it's becoming revolutionary in college sports where we want to weigh this and have an algorithm to go. Do you think the Big 12 could follow that model, or are you almost giving yourself a bit safer longevity by keeping everyone at the same price tag?
You got to keep everybody the same price tag, but I will add this caveat, Drake. If you want to have that incentivized deal where you adjust the money for teams that are succeeding, take the postseason money, whether it's the NCAA tournament, college football playoff payouts, and the like. Postseason money, that's where you say, okay, if you've had a better year, you're getting a bigger share of that amount of money to incentivize these leagues. But you do not affect that overall bottom line with those TV revenue figures, because if you do that, as we just talked about, the ACC, whether you're at the bottom or the top, you are not happy with how things sit. The Big 12 can avoid a lot of that by making sure that there is a baseline of the TV revenue that you will get regardless, and then you incentivize the teams for succeeding by that postseason payout.
Based on Nielsen ratings, the Wild Ute on Twitter posts that Florida State, Clemson, and Miami were the most viewed schools in the ACC the last 5 years. They'll benefit the most from this move, whereas SMU, Boston College, Wake Forest, Virginia, and Cal are the bottom teams in the conference that will certainly see a cut in their athletic department's revenue from TV because the ACC is the one cutting it. Coming up, are we just headed for a Super League? Is all this just a moot point? This is a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Cougars crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hey, today's show is brought to you by Supply House. I just bought a house on Wilmington Island in Savannah, Georgia, and I need a lot of supplies. Get the supplies you need from the site that's made for skilled trades. Supply House. Whether you're plumbing, HVAC, electrical work, Supply House is reliable, easy to use, and a competitive inventory of over 200,000 parts from 400 plus brands. Find exactly what you need delivered fast, coast to coast. If you need help with an order, Supply House offers expert support and industry-leading service, so you'll always talk to a real person. And for trade pros looking for an extra edge, their free Trade Master program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage. Now it's your turn. Join the Trade Master program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Plus, use promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. That's supplyhouse.com. Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars last week on the Monty Show. Monty said, the man they call Monty said that we're headed toward a Super League. His sources have confirmed that there is substantive evidence that the SEC and the Big Ten are going to take up group of 5 schools, take up Big 12 schools, ACC schools, and create their own super conference. You work for a pretty reputable radio station. Like, you were at BYU practice yesterday. You've got boots on the ground in really the same region and have a lot of really good. Are you hearing anything close to this?
Frankly, no. And here's the deal. I have worked around Monty for quite some time, and I'll just be very blunt. I take everything he says with a grain of salt. His track record is less than stellar. Let's just put it that way. Now, I will say this, Drake. I think there's some point down the line that a super league or super leagues come into fruition, but the way that Monty talks about it, it's like it's coming tomorrow. That's just not going to happen. We just talked about the fact that the ACC, they've probably got a lifeline of about 3, 4, 5 years here before things really devolve into what we expect, the chaos that we all expect. But yeah, super leagues, it feels like they're still a ways off. And the bigger point to be made is, if you're going to create a super league, where is the money going to come from to fund that? Are the ESPNs, the Foxes of the world, but whether it's Amazon or Netflix, are they going to want to pony up the potential billions, with a B, billions of dollars to make this reality? That's a massive question mark, and those are answers that remain unanswered right now. So, I take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I think you said a lot without saying too much there, Jake. The tell for me, this is, as you alluded to, a conversation where anything leaked would likely come from ESPN or from Fox, from a TV network, or some sort of entity that is going to sponsor the Super League happening, that has the money to say, hey, because we just learned it's a $200 million price tag to exit the ACC. So if you're going to create a Super League, someone has to have $1 billion to pluck out the valuable teams from the ACC and place them in the SEC or the Big Ten. And that same goes to the Big 12. Yeah, Jake.
And that's just the $1 billion to get them out of the league. And then you have the, let's say, hundreds of millions that are going to be paid out in media rights deals, because I don't know if they have pro rata clauses with the Big Ten and the SEC right now, but the way that money's going for those conferences, there are going to be $100 million payouts for each of these schools. Do you have a pro rata clause with ESPN or Fox that says, hey, if we add X, Y, and Z school, that goes up by $100, $200, $300 million? I have a question as to if they're going to be willing to do that.
Yeah, it's going to cost somebody a lot of money, especially if this does happen tomorrow. Overall, are we, if you're a Big 12 fan and you hear this kind of news, and this almost gets into a journalistic conversation of what to believe and how to, you mentioned grain of salt. If you're a Big 12 fan and you hear this news, should I be scared? Is this like a break the glass, press the red button? How do you vet? This is almost a question of how do you vet information right now?
Well, here's the deal. Listen to everything, trust nobody. I've heard that from multiple people in the media sphere. The bigger point to be made here is, yeah, the future of college football is really unclear right now. What ultimately is going to morph into? We're watching guys, Drake, now as college football players making millions of dollars. My university, speaking of BYU, is going to pay a basketball player reportedly $8.5 million next year to play one season of basketball in Provo, Utah. Had you told me that 10 years ago that BYU is going to be getting the number one recruit in the country and they're going to pay him darn near $10 million to come and play, I would have fallen over and said, yeah, you're lying. But here's the deal. That's the future and what the present is in college football, and it's only going to get worse from there. Anybody who says they know what the future of college football is right now and what it's going to be, they're lying through their teeth.
There is a non-zero chance that we ultimately do go to a Super League. You throw something against a wall and it sticks. Hey, if I'm breaking in 10 years, the AAC is going to be different than it is today. I am breaking that news. My sources are telling me that's just, it's very likely we'll get to what you could call a Super League at some point. Do you think that is based on kind of what we talked about with the ACC 2030? Like, how soon could, if we're just throwing out takes here, throwing out sources, how soon could that actually come to fruition?
To me, I think it's 2030 at the very earliest. That just feels like that's kind of the clear marker of when these media rights deals for a bunch of the conferences, including the Big 12, come up for their next round of negotiations. As you've already talked about, the ACC could be on its way to being completely gutted at that point. That feels like the very earliest. But once again, we're seeing multi-billion-dollar media rights deals being signed by pro leagues out there. I just feel like, can you get an ESPN that all of a sudden is leveraged with debt? They just canceled their MLB contract, tried to essentially, take it from $500 million to $200 million, and you can expect that the ESPN's going to turn right around 5 years from now and be willing to pay $3-4 billion for this proposed super league that you don't necessarily know what the parameters and the look of it's going to be. I'm hard pressed to believe that that's going to be able to come to fruition that quickly. So I think we're probably looking middle part of the next decade, so maybe 10 years from now before something really happens.
Yeah, if the ESPN is losing money on a product like Major League Baseball, and we've seen they've ruined the NBA as well and the NHL, it's tough for.
Yeah, and that's the thing, that they paid the NBA $2.8 billion, and that's a big reason why they cut back on their MLB contract. Because all of a sudden they're like, hold on, the math isn't mathing here of our return on investment for the NBA, but we got to have the NBA. So they're overpaying for a product and trying to cut in other areas. We've already seen the cutbacks with their talent, et cetera, the behind the scenes and both on-air staff. ESPN's an unsustainable model in terms of, I think, what the money, where it's being thrown around. And that is where I have question marks about if they can really fund what some people believe college football is going towards.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they're going to be able to, especially the way that they've now taken the SEC under their wing. And again, we've seen ESPN kill the NBA and kill the MLB. Will the SEC be the next victim of what ESPN puts you through under contract? Jake, is this, though, I want to play the role of TV executive.
Okay.
We all love Thursday night football, Monday night football, Sunday night when the Chiefs are playing against the Lions. Everyone loves that. Tune in. It's awesome. What ESPN, it seems, what I want to do as a TV executive is give you more Georgia, Ohio State. Now, instead of just seeing that once a year, you get it twice a year and then in a national championship format. You make it almost NFL. Like, I want 30 teams so we see more often Alabama play Michigan. Yeah. Why shouldn't I try to get that? Why shouldn't I try to bring college football to where it's just 30 power programs that are playing marquee games all the time?
Well, you should try for that. The question is, are all the other parties that would be privy to that conversation or conversations, are they all going to be on the same board here? Because you got two very proud leagues in the Big Ten and the SEC who have got their own traditions, their own power programs. Are they going to be willing to essentially acquiesce to each other's request and say, hey, we'll do whatever you guys want us to do? We're seeing the TV numbers and the TV executives, they control this sport more and more, and they will continue to do so as they pump more money into it. I'm just wondering at some point if there's a breaking point for these leagues, Drake, where they push back and say, you know what, enough's enough. We have essentially done everything you've wanted us to do. We have fractured rivalries. We have completely eliminated conferences. We have broken up fan bases essentially along conference lines. Where's the breaking point here? And I think at some point they will hit that. But then again, I've seen things I never thought I'd see in college football. So maybe they'll just keep going along with what the TV executives want them to do.
As long as there's money there, that's what they're chasing after. Coming up, BYU got Utah's basketball coach fired. What? This is a Locked On Big 12 Locked On Cougars crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. That is Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars. And oddly enough, why not bring him on to talk a little bit about Utah? They have fired their basketball coach, Craig Smith. And the first thing I pointed to in this is BYU's the reason why. BYU's the reason why because there's an arms race between those two schools, to me, outside source, that is more aggressive than ever of mine is bigger. I can do it better. And if you start losing to BYU, or if you fall behind as an athletic department the way football did last year, now more than maybe ever that they're in the same conference, you must win. You must win, not just against one another, but in general, from a revenue standpoint. Otherwise, you are fired if you cannot do what BYU is doing as a Utah Ute, or you're fired if you cannot do what the Utes are doing as a coach at BYU. I think, and maybe it's toxic, it feels like BYU has a hand in now every decision that Utah makes when it comes to its staff.
Well, you're dead on with that. Here's the deal, Drake. Craig Smith, if the reports are to be believed, he essentially was let go because his relations with the NIL donor base at Utah, which already is in question as to how lucrative and how deep a pool it is, had soured. And when you essentially the people that are funding your program with those NIL checks, that relationship goes south, well, there goes the coach, and we got to start over there. You're right. BYU, and they had a booster tell Myron Medcalf from ESPN that we, quote, we will not be outbid, unquote. I never in a million years, Drake, having covered BYU as long as I have, would have ever expected a booster from BYU to be so bold to say that on the record to a national reporter. But guess what? They have laid out what they're going to do, and BYU's got deep-pocketed boosters who are stepping to the forefront. And Ryan Smith obviously takes a lot of the notoriety being the owner of the Utah Jazz, Utah Hockey Club, and a few other pro franchises here. But he is not the only one. They have got dozens upon dozens of other tech executives. They work in multiple fields who have got hundreds of millions of dollars in reserve, apparently, that are willing to invest it into BYU. And so long as that happens, University of Utah is saying, okay, we got to be able to match that in some form or fashion. And you're right. What BYU does is going to affect Utah and vice versa. Anything that Utah succeeds with and BYU fails at, guess what? It's going to have an impact on both of these two programs.
Jake, let's talk about Ryan Smith, who owns the Utah Jazz, the Utah Hockey Club, the soccer team. He owns pretty much every major sports entity out there. There are Utah fans that are very upset that a guy who is so involved in the public sphere, who is so involved in different sports teams that do take taxpayer money for stadiums or venues or different things, like this is a guy who's he directly has ownership of Utah fans' favorite teams, favorite pro teams, and he won't give a dime. He won't divvy out, help out, become somebody who can be a trusted Utah donor as well. I see that on message boards all the time, on Twitter all the time. Why isn't Ryan Smith giving to Utah? Because of what the state of Utah gives to him. Why is that? Is there a leg to stand on if you're a Utah fan for Ryan Smith being all in on the BYU Cougars?
Here's the deal. Ryan Smith has made it very clear that BYU supported his father and his family during a time of a health crisis in that family's in a period of life before Ryan became ultra wealthy, and his dad did and his brother did. They were all in on this Qualtrics deal when it really blew up. Before that, BYU supported that family through a really trying time in that family's in that family circle, and that has endeared BYU into the hearts and minds of the Smith family, in particular Ryan Smith. Utah fans can whine all they want, but they have some really deep-pocketed individuals up there. I think of the Huntsman family. I think of the Eccles family, the Garf family in the auto industry. You've got to get those people motivated and start having those people donate, because they are the people that will make the tangible difference here and hopefully counter what Ryan Smith and other boosters at BYU are doing. Ryan's not the biggest donor to BYU's NIL fund. I hate to break it to anybody out there. I'm sure Utah fans will love to bash me in my comments for making that statement, but I have it on very good authority that he is not the biggest NIL donor for BYU. He is contributing to NIL, absolutely, but Ryan grew up a BYU guy. He's a BYU fan, and the way that BYU supported his family during a time of need, well, guess what? That has engendered some love and respect on both sides, and BYU's benefiting from it.
Utah, it sounds as though, from the outside looking in, is struggling in the NIL category more than BYU, despite those reports last week that BYU's NIL collective director spoke to the team and said, "You're all greedy little pigs. I'm not giving you any money." Why would the guy who works at McDonald's, like the manager of McDonald's, walk in and say, "I hate all of you, back to work"? Like that. It didn't happen, right?
Well, here's the thing. The conversation, Min Kim, who they quoted, who's the CEO of NutriCost, who's actually one of the bigger donors to BYU's NIL fund, that meeting absolutely did happen, Drake. I can report that because I have it on multiple fronts that meeting did occur. And he essentially said what he said in that circumstance. The issue was, at the time, BYU got a major boost on the NIL front when they joined the Big 12 Conference. A lot of boosters were excited. We're in the Power 5. We finally live in the dream that BYU's wanted to do. And then you go out and suffer a 5-7 losing season in college football. Guess what? People don't want to pay for losers. And that's what Min Kim said. I want to pay for winners. Guess what? Everybody wants to pay for a winner. That's the simple fact of the matter. Mm-hmm. So guess what? When some boosters started pulling away and pulling back some of the money they had originally allotted to NIL, all of a sudden you got to go and find new boosters. they got reinvigorated with an 11-2 season this past year in football. And that's a credit to the players, the coaches, the administrators, everybody involved with BYU football. Suddenly the money's flowing once again into that program. I wouldn't be surprised if another report, probably won't come from the Salt Lake Tribune, comes out that says, hey, BYU has restored a bunch of the money that they may have pulled back from some of these players because there's more money in the NIL fund, there's more money from the collective, etc. But the simple fact of the matter is everybody, and I mean not just BYU, across the board, when you're contributing hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, when what you perceive to be your ROI, your return on investment, doesn't match up with what you expect, well, guess what? You're going to be more reticent to contribute money to that fund. And that was the result of what happened with the 5-7 season. Well, they go 11-2 the next year, and suddenly that spigot is wide open again.
Yeah, so interesting, the entire story that came out with that with BYU. But after doing research, it seems like Utah is reeling. Their fan base, at the very least, is not excited about where NIL is. Their coaching staff is not, on the basketball side at the very least. And for BYU, NIL is better now than it really has ever been. The commitment is better now than it has been. What is the limit, right? We talk about, for BYU in the next few years, what's the ceiling with the money that's seemingly rolling in? It feels like BYU, who was the sleeping giant when they joined the Big 12, is finally waking up.
You're right. And that's the thing about this is BYU is finally realizing, hey, we can be a force at this level. And obviously it requires millions of dollars. It's just money speaks. And BYU has got a booster group that is ultra motivated to help BYU as much as they possibly can to elevate them to top tier status in the Big 12 conference. This is a program, Drake, that when they were in the WAC and the Mountain West, they were one of, if not the preeminent program in both of those leagues during long stretches of their history in both of those leagues. They went independent for well over a decade with the whole goal of living the dream they're living now. And now that they're living it, guess what? The money's starting to flow in. And as we have seen in college sports across the board, the more you invest in programs, there's a direct correlation to success in whatever sport you're investing it in. In this case, football and basketball. And BYU, they're going to be a force in this conference for years to come if they continue doing what they're doing.
Jake, I am continually made fun of and berated on Twitter and YouTube for being such a big BYU homer, but I've had JT Wistersill on this show 3 times since the last time you joined. So I just want to make it very clear here that I have no favorites in this league, though BYU has always been kind to me. Where can more folks find your work?
If you want all things BYU in a podcast form, check out Locked On Cougars, wherever you get your podcasts, also on YouTube. If you want my thoughts on all things sports, you can check out 2 different places. Locked On Cougars on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or my personal Twitter feed, Jacob C. Hatch. Love to interact with anybody who wants to reach out at any time.
That's Jake Hatch. This has been a crossover of Locked On BYU and Locked On. Thanks for making it your Locked On Cougars and Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.